There comes a point in a woman's life, often around midlife, when the old ways of living no longer feel bearable. The roles she once accepted, the compromises she once made, and the silences she once endured begin to weigh heavily against her soul. What once seemed enough, stability, companionship, or the avoidance of solitude, suddenly feels like a betrayal of her essence. This is not rebellion for the sake of rebellion, it is the inner call of individuation, the process Carl Jung described as aligning the external life with the deepest truth of the inner self. To refuse to settle is not stubbornness, it is the soul demanding wholeness. At midlife, the unconscious speaks more loudly than ever. For decades, many women have lived by expectations, giving, adjusting, accommodating. Yet the unconscious, Jung wrote, does not remain silent forever. It begins to press, often through dreams, unease, or the quiet feeling that something is missing even when life looks good on the outside. To refuse lesser love, lesser respect, or lesser authenticity is not arrogance. It is a response to that inner voice saying, "Your life must match your truth, or you will feel divided." This is why many women describe this period as a turning point. They can no longer live halfway. Examples of this awakening appear in countless stories. A woman in her 40s who ends a relationship that looks stable but leaves her empty because she knows that silence is not peace. Another who changes careers after decades of conformity, realizing that financial security cannot replace meaning. Another who chooses solitude rather than staying in a bond where her needs are constantly minimized. To outsiders, these decisions may appear reckless or demanding, but to the woman herself, they are acts of survival, the only path to honoring the fullness of her being. The paradox is that what looks like defiance from the outside is actually maturity from within. Settling once felt safe, even necessary. But safety without alignment slowly corrodes the psyche. Jung observed that when the inner self is ignored, symptoms of emptiness, anxiety, and despair arise. What seems like taimosia, stubborn refusal, is actually the psyche demanding integrity. The woman who no longer accepts less is not resisting love or life. She is resisting fragmentation. She is saying yes to her inner wholeness, even if it means saying no to external approval. Psychologically, this refusal to settle carries profound impact. It restores energy once lost in pretending, it strengthens self-respect, eroded by compromise, and it unlocks desires long buried beneath duty. A woman at this stage no longer seeks validation outside of herself. She seeks congruence, the alignment of her choices with her essence. And in that alignment, she discovers a deeper form of peace than any shallow companionship could provide. Jung would call this individuation, the birth of the true self out of the masks worn for survival. In midlife, this process often intensifies because time itself becomes a mirror. The awareness of years lived and years left awakens urgency. There is no longer space for pretending, for settling, for delaying authenticity. The woman realizes that her life must now be lived from the inside out. And in that realization, she steps into a maturity that refuses to be silenced. Ultimately, what appears to others as resistance is, in fact, rebirth. The refusal to settle at midlife is the soul's declaration that she has come too far, endured too much, and grown too deeply to accept crumbs where she deserves fullness. It is not the end of love, but the beginning of a love that matches her truth. It is not the end of life, but the moment she claims it as her own. And in that refusal, she does not lose. She finally begins to live whole. For generations, women were taught that conformity was survival. To have a man, even one who gave little, was better than to be alone. To remain silent in the face of disrespect was expected because breaking silence meant being labeled difficult. This cultural inheritance still echoes strongly at midlife. Many women watched mothers and grandmothers accept crumbs of affection, sacrificing dreams in exchange for companionship, convinced that endurance was their duty. Yet something shifts with maturity. The weight of these inherited expectations no longer fits. Refusing to settle becomes not just a personal choice, but an act of breaking a chain that has silenced women for decades. Carl Jung described the collective shadow as the hidden assumptions and fears a society carries unconsciously. In the lives of women, this shadow often took the form of submission, compliance, and the belief that self-sacrifice was the price of love. To walk away from this shadow is to confront not only one's personal fear, but the fear of disappointing culture itself. And yet, when a woman refuses to conform in midlife, she is not only liberating herself, she is healing generations. Her refusal becomes a statement. The cycle ends with me. The psychological effect of breaking with this conformity is profound. No longer bound by the need to please, she feels lighter, more expansive, more alive. She begins to recognize that love without respect is not love, that presence without reciprocity is not partnership. The energy once spent maintaining appearances is reclaimed for her own growth. This shift is not rebellion, born of bitterness, but courage born of clarity. She understands that staying where she is, devalued, is not loyalty, but self-abandonment, and so she chooses differently. Everyday life shows clear examples of this rupture with inherited patterns. A woman who watched her mother remain silent in a cold marriage decides she will not repeat that silence. She files for divorce and discovers her voice in the process. Another, whose grandmother taught her that any man is better than none, chooses solitude over a relationship that drains her. Another refuses to accept emotional neglect disguised as companionship, even when friends pressure her to be grateful. Each of these women represents not only herself, but the breaking of an intergenerational script. This act of refusal carries symbolic weight. It is healing that extends backward and forward in time. It honors the women who endured because they had no choice, while paving the way for daughters and granddaughters to demand more. In Jungian terms, this is the archetype of the mature rebel. She does not rebel to destroy, but to free. She disobeys the rules that once demanded her silence, because obedience now would mean betrayal of her soul. Her defiance is not recklessness, but wisdom. The wisdom to know that settling is not survival, but erasure. The paradox is striking. Society may call her refusal selfish, but in truth, it is the most life-giving choice she can make. By walking away from conformity, she is not rejecting love. She is rejecting counterfeit versions of it. She is not scorning companionship. She is honoring connection that sustains rather than diminishes. What once looked like rebellion is, in reality, reclamation. She is reclaiming her right to dignity, to authenticity, to live a life that reflects her inner truth, rather than cultural scripts. Ultimately, to refuse conformity at midlife is to step into a deeper kind of loyalty to herself. The courage to say no to what diminishes becomes the same courage that allows her to say yes to what is true. And in doing so, she redefines not only her own path, but the path of those who come after her. For what seems like rebellion is in truth a profound act of healing, the moment when a woman stops repeating the past and begins writing a future where dignity is no longer negotiable. Midlife often strips away illusions, leaving a woman face to face with herself. The roles she once played, to please, to belong, to be chosen, begin to feel too heavy to carry. What rises in their place is a rediscovery of her true worth, uncovered layer by layer as she sheds the masks she once believed necessary. This awakening is not sudden. It emerges from years of experience, disappointment, resilience, and growth. By the time it arrives, she no longer negotiates her dignity in exchange for affection. She knows that her value is not dependent on approval, but on the truth she has claimed within. Carl Jung described the process of individuation as bringing to light what was once hidden in the shadow. For many women, midlife becomes the stage where unconscious truths rise into awareness. Desires once buried beneath duty begin to speak. Needs once silenced out of fear demand to be acknowledged. The woman who once tolerated crumbs suddenly sees the pattern clearly, not as love, but as compromise that stole from her essence. This integration of the shadow allows her to face what she once avoided, the truth that she deserves more, and that to continue accepting less is to abandon herself. The psychological impact of this rediscovery is profound. Instead of longing for external validation, she begins to feel guided by an internal compass. She no longer rushes to explain her choices, because she knows that what is authentic does not require justification. She no longer apologizes for wanting respect, reciprocity, and depth, because these are not luxuries, they are necessities. Each step toward alignment strengthens her confidence, and that confidence radiates outward, shaping the way others respond to her. Daily life illustrates this transformation in subtle but powerful ways. A woman who once stayed quiet to avoid conflict now speaks with calm certainty. Another who once bent herself to fit another's expectations now holds her ground without guilt. Another who once feared solitude now embraces it as proof of her independence, discovering peace in her own company. These are not acts of rebellion alone, but of rebirth, signals that her value has been reborn from within, no longer dependent on how others measure it. This shift also changes the way she loves. She no longer confuses passion with respect or attention with commitment. She watches actions rather than believing empty promises. She knows that real intimacy requires dignity, and she refuses to build connection on the foundation of her own erasure. What once felt like love when wrapped in intensity is now recognized as immaturity. What once tempted her to settle is now filtered out by her clarity. Jung's idea of shadow integration explains this clarity. By acknowledging the parts of herself she once denied, her needs, her frustrations, her longings, she becomes whole. She is no longer split between the self she presented and the self she concealed. This wholeness creates magnetism because it resonates as authenticity. She is not pretending to be confident, she truly is. She is not performing dignity, she embodies it. And this embodiment draws respect naturally, without demand. Ultimately, the rediscovery of personal worth in midlife is not about becoming someone new. It is about finally being who she always was beneath the masks. The woman who embraces this truth refuses to settle, not because she is bitter, but because she is whole. And in her wholeness, she realizes that dignity, clarity, and self-respect are not negotiable. They are the foundation of her life moving forward, the compass by which she chooses everything, including love. There is a quiet power in the woman who no longer needs to be chosen in order to feel whole. Midlife brings with it a freedom that acts as a natural filter. She is no longer caught in the exhausting cycle of proving her worth through relationships. Instead, her very posture communicates, "I am already complete." This completeness does not repel love, it refines it. It eliminates fragile connections that depend on urgency and draws in those capable of meeting her with reciprocity. The woman who refuses to settle radiates a different kind of magnetism, not the magnetism of need, but of choice. Carl Jung would say, "This is individuation in action, the integration of the self into a unified whole that no longer depends on external affirmation." The woman at this stage becomes both soft and firm, receptive yet discerning. She understands that authentic connection cannot be built on desperation, so she honors her own pace. Her energy no longer scatters in the hope of being validated. Instead, it remains centered, and in that center, she becomes a beacon. Those who cannot respect it fall away. Those who can are drawn closer with reverence. The psychological impact of this freedom is profound. Without the fear of loneliness dictating her choices, she can truly evaluate relationships on their merit. She no longer interprets every gesture as proof of love, nor every absence as proof of rejection. She sees with clearer eyes because her value is not on trial. This clarity transforms her presence. Men sense it immediately. She does not chase, she does not plead, she does not shrink. She is present in her wholeness, and that wholeness commands respect. Daily examples reveal how this freedom changes dynamics. A woman no longer responds to emotional games. Instead, she calmly withdraws. Another declines half-hearted invitations, making space only for those who approach her with intention. Another notices when a man tries to diminish her boundaries and ends the exchange without guilt. Each act may seem small, but together they communicate a truth that cannot be ignored. Her life does not depend on who stays, but on how she chooses. This authority makes her presence unforgettable. The paradox is that the more she stops negotiating her dignity, the more magnetic she becomes. Fragile men may retreat, unable to face a woman who does not bend for approval. Yet those who are whole in themselves are drawn in, knowing that they are standing before someone who will not tolerate illusions. The love she attracts at this stage is not shallow or hurried. It is rooted in respect, because only respect has survived the filtering power of her freedom. This stage embodies the archetype of the queen. The queen does not ask for permission to exist. She does not lower her standards to be accepted. She reigns from her own center, expecting alliances of equality, not subservience. Her presence is not about dominance, but about clarity. She will share her life, but she will not diminish it. In this way, she embodies both maturity and magnetism, a combination that no fleeting attraction can compete with. Ultimately, midlife becomes not a decline, but a coronation for the woman who refuses to settle. Her freedom becomes her filter, her clarity becomes her power, and her self-possession becomes her magnetism. Love that cannot meet her strength falls away. Love that endures is love that honors her as she is. And in this, she proves that refusing to settle is not a rejection of connection, but an invitation to relationships worthy of her truth. To reach midlife and refuse to settle is not a sign of bitterness, it is a sign of vitality. While society often paints this stage as decline, many women discover it as rebirth. They no longer measure themselves by youth or conformity, but by alignment with their own essence. What some call stubbornness is, in truth, the refusal to abandon authenticity. To walk away from what diminishes, even when it means being alone, is not failure. It is the clearest expression of self-respect. In this choice, aging ceases to be loss and becomes transformation. Carl Jung described individuation as the journey of becoming whole, and midlife offers a powerful opportunity for this process. With the awareness that time is finite, a woman feels urgency not to waste herself in what is shallow or false. She begins to say no with greater clarity, because each no preserves the years she has left for what truly matters. This consciousness of time is not heavy, it is liberating. It propels her toward choices that reflect her inner truth rather than external approval. Aging then becomes not an ending, but a sharpening of focus. The psychological impact of this refusal to settle is profound. Instead of clinging to what feels safe, she opens herself to what feels true. She accepts solitude if the alternative is compromise. She embraces change if the alternative is stagnation. Each decision becomes a declaration. I am no longer living halfway. The strength of this posture radiates beyond her, inspiring others to question their own patterns of conformity. Her life becomes testimony that dignity, once claimed, can never again be surrendered without cost. Stories of women at this stage reveal how transformative this choice can be. One ends a long, unfulfilling marriage and discovers not loneliness, but freedom to pursue long-neglected dreams. Another changes her career in her 50s, trading security for authenticity, and finds not regret but joy. Another devotes her midlife years to art, travel, or service, and attracts connections richer than any she had before. These women show that midlife is not a closing door, but an open threshold, a season of new beginnings. This refusal also reframes how aging is perceived. Instead of fearing wrinkles or changes, she interprets them as symbols of survival. Each mark tells a story, each gray strand testifies to endurance. She does not diminish her femininity with age, she deepens it. She embodies maturity as magnetism, showing that beauty does not fade, but transforms. By honoring her story instead of resisting it, she becomes more radiant, not in spite of her years, but because of them. Here, the archetype of the queen finds its full expression. The queen in midlife does not apologize for existing, nor does she plead to be chosen. She chooses herself, and from that throne of self-possession, she decides who may join her realm. Her reign is not over others, but over her own destiny. In this sense, refusing to settle is not rebellion, but sovereignty. The acceptance that her life belongs to her alone, and that sharing it is a privilege, not an entitlement. Ultimately, to refuse to settle in midlife is to claim aging as victory. It is to see the years not as dwindling resources, but as sharpened tools for truth. It is to embrace the second half of life not with resignation, but with renewal. And in this renewal, women discover the greatest paradox of all. What society calls the end is, in truth, a beginning, the flowering of a self that has been waiting patiently to live whole.